Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari are very difficult thinkers. I think that is uncontroversial, to say the least, to say. Deleuze and Guattari, which I'm going to say Guattari. I know it's Guattari, but I'm not going to pronounce it that way over and over because I'm lazy, are postmodern thinkers, and they bear a lot of similarities to Foucault, to me. Both of them, that being Deleuze and Guattari, or D&G, and Foucault, as kind of two different entities, kind of represent two different responses to Nietzsche. And in a sense, they are the postmodern reincarnation of Nietzsche. And while Foucault tends to exacerbate that sense of skepticism and kind of genealogical uprooting of Nietzsche, for me, Deleuze and Guattari represent Nietzsche's optimism. And in a sense, we're going to talk about, kind of briefly, what is going on with Deleuze and Guattari, because they're using very strange language, purposely mechanistic language, and they're talking a lot about Freudian psychoanalysis. So we're just going to kind of talk a little bit about what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do. Now, we have to situate D&G and also Foucault kind of as a little Nietzschean binary in relation to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is very famous for having very scathing critiques of a lot of ideas such as morality or God, really these overarching metaphysical ideas. He thought that that was not an effective way to go about understanding material relations here in the world. He was a very in der Welt sein kind of person, being in the world, or in the world being, as Heidegger says. And Nietzsche is concerned with trying to cut past the fluff, and he brings in certain ideas that Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari play on in different ways. Now, if you've seen my videos on Foucault, you know that Foucault is, like Deleuze and Guattari, critical of overarching transcendental meta-narratives to understand the world. Foucault is famous, in one of his interviews, he said, kind of his job as a philosopher, what he's trying to answer, the question is, who are we and how did we get here? And the point of that is that Foucault saw humans as contingent to the discursive realities that they live within, which is to say that being is structured by its relations to other things. Hegel made this very clear in the master-slave dialectic, and in a sense, it opened up the idea of definitions or identities of particular things, of emergence, of existential emergence, as a byproduct of its relations to other things. And Hegel saw that this relationship between different things and the identities that form are structured by an inequality that's going to form. And Foucault rightly understands, just like Nietzsche, that this is power. And that power structures our way of viewing things. For example, the first versus third world. Built into this idea of first versus third world is that the first world is a higher form of the third world. The third world is a sort of deteriorated form which has to climb up this hierarchical ladder to get to the first world. This is why a lot of people today are quite critical of this idea of a first versus third world. And this is why a lot of people are also critical of Marxian class conflict, this bourgeoisie versus proletariat, that maybe this isn't necessarily an effective way to look at identity. But for Foucault, and Deleuze and Guattari don't obfuscate this idea or get rid of it, but Foucault said that the identity of any being is structured by a discursive reality, by a discourse, which is to say a situation defined by relations to other things. And Foucault understood that identity was maximally contingent upon other things, that for anything to have identity, it has to be structured in a discourse which is defined by power. Certain terms are going to be defined by certain people who have the ability to do so, and this gets reinforced through various institutions like clinics and madhouses and the police and states. And this is Foucault's work broadly, is a historical look at human relations to see why certain terms like madness or the idea of objective knowledge or the idea of science is actually very contingent to relations, and more specifically power, that is structuring them discursively. Deleuze and Guattari are kind of shifting away from this in a sense, and I even taped from the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy the introduction to Deleuze, and it says that he wants to grasp the philosophical terrain in the middle. His method overthrows subject-object relations in order to initiate a philosophy of difference and chance that is not derived from static being, a philosophy of the event, not the signifier signified. Which is to say, Deleuze and Guattari are critical of overarching narratives just like Foucault is, in the sense that, for example, a classical meta-narrative per se is the idea of God. So we have God that stands above things and takes something like a human, which we can consider as sort of a pre-discursive term before it has a relation to God, and God takes the term human and turns it into, I don't know, child of God. So the overarching meta-narrative acts on a term which we can call pre-discursive, and we can also call into question if there is ever a pre-discursive reality. But it acts on this term and transforms it into something which gains its identity in relationship to the higher term. And this creates a sort of tripartite structure in which identity is formed in relationship to a higher meta-narrative, which is considered the analytic framework for looking at reality. And this doesn't need to be God. This could be, this could be power is another one. And that's basically what Foucault is saying. And this is why a lot of people are critical of Foucault. And this isn't necessarily me endorsing these critiques, but more just pointing them out. Is that some people say that the way Foucault uses power is something that is necessarily going to lead to a restriction of the subject. And it's not really a criticism of Foucault, because this is what Foucault says, that we are always going to have an inequality between terms, in the sense that we always have to start from somewhere in this. Say we start with human, and the human becomes a child of God. And that is in relationship to a term in the future, which is God. So in a sense, we can imagine rotating this tripartite structure such that we have a new term on the top. And we can see the hierarchicization going on here, or hierarchicalization. I'm not sure the right term. Probably made it up. But Foucault says, nevertheless, we're always going to have a top term. We can't really get rid of this top term because identity always requires a discursive context in order for something pre-discursive, something that just is in the world on its own, to have an identity. And that is only via a signifier, which is this overarching meta-narrative, which could be God, it could be power, or it could be Oedipus, the Freudian Oedipus complex, which is going to take, and we might just need to erase this and draw this anew. With the Oedipus complex, Oedipus is always our overarching term. And in relationship to Oedipus, we have, let's say, libidinal flows. This is kind of some Freudian terms here. This flow of desire. And Oedipus is going to take certain flows and make these flows represent something so that they can be formative for identity. Because no one's going to deny that there are flows within the human psychology. You can think of this, physically, like flows within the body, and you can think of it more abstractly. And these are going to create what it means to be a person, but in relationship to certain other ideas. These are things like taboos, which are going to structure what is allowed to come through and make itself manifest. And for the Oedipus complex, it's going to take these bare libidinal flows and turn them into something that can come out as a subject. But Freud, kind of similar to Foucault, creates this discursive situation where we have the Oedipus complex, which is kind of our analytic framework, like God, for talking about flows of desire that create the subject. And Freud is doing a similar thing. He's trying to take psychology and make it something that is contextual to not just material, physical things like neurons and things like this, and hormones, but also is going to have a relationship to social norms and things that are passed down through the generations that may not necessarily be genetic, although we could certainly treat them kind of as a genetic thing, but a social thing, kind of like Richard Dawkins talking about memes, these being kind of social things that are passed down in a genetic type of way. And Deleuze and Guattari are going to challenge meta-narratives in the sense that the problem here is that we never really get back to pure flows. We are never just able to access desire, because desire is filtered through kind of a matrix like Foucault talks about. And this matrix right here is defined by the actions of the Oedipus complex that are going to let certain behaviors through and certain behaviors not come through. And this is going to found psychoanalysis's idea that your familial relations are basically going to define your particular subjectivity. And Deleuze and Guattari are going to say that in a different way than Foucault, we should challenge meta-narratives like this. but not in a way where we try to get out from under meta-narratives, because like Foucault showed, we're always going to be in a discursive practice. But what Deleuze and Guattari want to do is get outside of subject-object. Because like in Hegel's master-slave dialectic, there is a privileged term in the dialectic, kind of like I've talked about in my video on Homi Bhabha, which I think it would be very interesting to talk about Homi Bhabha in relationship to Deleuze and Guattari. But there is kind of a privileged term of there's a subject who looks upon objects and there's something qualitatively different. Deleuze and Guattari are like, no. Everything is a process of desire acting upon the body without organs. And we're going to talk about these terms because I think that's really going to allow you to understand what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say. But they want us to try to get out from under these meta-narratives and try to see true difference. We don't want to see pure objects, because pure objects are created discursively. We want to see flows, and we want to see relations. On page 4 of Anti-Oedipus, they say, not man as the king of creation, but rather as the being who is in intimate contact with the profound life of all forms, or all types of beings, who is responsible for even the stars and animal life, and who ceaselessly plugs an organ machine into an energy machine, a tree into his body, a breast into his mouth, the sun into his asshole, the eternal custodian of the machines of the universe. And we see quite clearly they are talking a lot about machines, and machines for them represent an economy of desire. And for Deleuze and Guattari, Oedipus is an artificial constraint put on the flows that form what it means to be a subject or an object, which for them is basically the same thing. That this is an artificial constraint. And in a sense, and they talk about this pretty early on within the first 100 pages of Anti-Oedipus, which is basically all I'm through so far, so I'm not finished with the book, that, Hegel is trying to understand difference as sameness. They're trying to take into account these different forms, the flows of desire going into subjectivity, and they're trying, or Hegel, he is trying to look at difference in terms of the one, the overarching meta-narrative, which throughout Anti-Oedipus, as the name implies, is against Oedipus as a legitimate structure because they see it as putting us in a double bind. And they want to go for a philosophy that does not discriminate between certain terms, but rather aims for a philosophy of affirmation. They say, the body without organs is an egg. It is crisscrossed with axes and thresholds, with latitudes and longitudes and geodesic lines, traversed by gradients, marking the transitions and the becomings, the destinations of the subject developing along these particular vectors. Nothing here is representative. Rather, it is all life and lived experience. The actual lived emotion of having breasts does not resemble breasts. It does not represent them any more than a predestined zone in the egg resembles the organ that it is going to be stimulated to produce within itself. Nothing but bands of intensity, potentials, thresholds, and gradients. A harrowing, emotionally overwhelming experience which brings the schizo as close as possible to matter, to a burning, living center of matter. This emotion, situated outside of the particular point where the mind is searching for it, one's entire soul flows into this emotion that makes the mind aware of the terribly disturbing sound of matter and passes through its white-hot flame. And there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm trying not to be too text-dense in this, but they want to get out of a style of thinking which I've heard called representational thinking. The idea behind representation is one that Plato started, and I talked about this in my previous video on Hegel. But Plato sees lots of different objects. Let's say we have some tables, and they are varying in their different properties. This one has 3 legs. There's all these different things. And when we're trying to understand ontology, what it means to be, what it means when I say I am, what that am does, and how things come to exist versus not exist, that we can kind of take stock of different properties, such as the number of legs, or the shape and size, or something like this. But really, when we try to examine what a property actually means, for example, what is red in this case, or what is a red table? Let's just take red for now. Think about explaining what red is to a blind person. I mean, there's all kinds of videos on YouTube of like blind people trying, there's like a meme a few years ago of like kids trying to explain to a blind guy what colors were, and a girl was like, you know when something is blue, but it's not? And he was like, I'm blind.
When you think of colors, what do you think of?
How should I explain this? I don't know how to. I have to think. Have you ever saw a color of a blueberry?
I've never seen anything, ever. That's the whole point.
And it's like, yeah, that's the kind of insistence that we should expect when we only have unity. Without difference, without a space with which we can reference things to what they are not, to their opposite or something like this. Without that, we don't have identity. So the idea of redness only makes sense in relation to blackness or something like this. Some other category that when someone asks me, what is red? I can say, well, it's not black. Because without that, all I can basically say is red is red. All I can do with unity is make tautologies. But with reference to difference, we're getting somewhere. But Plato thought that all these properties had meaning insofar as they were related to a higher being, a perfect table. Perfect red table. I don't even know if you can see that. Hopefully you can. But all of these different properties have meaning in relation to the perfection of their property. And this is representationalism, the idea that something is in reference to some sort of ideal form. And we could really say that Hegel is doing this, because Hegel says that difference, that contradictions are defined by the dialectical form they create as they bump into one another and resolve the dialectic dialectically. And this is the problem with understanding difference as sameness. The problem with understanding terms as a lesser deficient term in relation to a higher, more perfect form is, what do we do when we want to talk about that more perfect form? Now we just have a unlocalized, I should say undifferentiated form at the top, which we can only make tautologies about. We can only say it is what it is, what it is, what it is. This is kind of some criticisms of God say that he is a rather tautological term, that he's timeless and spaceless and all this, and that his particular ontological status brings into question if he can have any objectivity, if he has no relation. But that's a whole nother thing. And in a sense, and Deleuze and Guattari will talk about this in A Thousand Plateaus, the sequel to Anti-Oedipus, is they will talk about arborescent thinking. This is the idea of a tree. And with a tree, we've got all the roots. And the roots go off in all these directions. And we could see these roots as difference. They are all these different identities that flow off in different ways, but only insofar as they have relation to one big trunk. We could say the same thing inversely for the leaves, that in a sense they are a birthing out of a form, but only in a relationship to a more primordial form, the earth or the roots or the base of the trunk. And when we do this, and really this is where we can talk about meta-narratives in two ways, or privileged terms. We could picture this image per se as we have a fundamental form down here, and this structures all the growth that is going to come, the position of these roots and the salinity of the soil and everything. This is our fundamental reality, and it's going to create a secondary or contingent reality. And it's an offshoot of the fundamental reality. And when we start talking about this tree, we may inevitably start talking about the leaves in their relation to the more fundamental form of the tree, the place from which they came. So in a sense, certain terms start to have a derivative quality, and maybe that's a better term here specifically than contingent, is derivative, because we sort of add in layers to our ontology where we have a more fundamental ontology. I didn't even mean to do that. That's a Heidegger reference. But we have a more fundamental form out of which secondary forms arise. And this invariably creates a situation where we could say that certain forms are a distortion of a more fundamental form. We could see this, for example, this is the roots of certain kinds of nationalism. Maybe you have down here the British, like as in the British Empire at its height. And since then, it has dwindled to have various forms, such as the UK and the US and Australia and others. And you could say, well, these are deficient forms of the original, more fundamental empire, and we should go back to the way things were. And we can see how this may be a little problematic, this representational kind of thinking, because in a sense, if we start to talk about the US or the UK or Australia in their relationship to a more fundamental form, and we say these are deficient forms of a more true form that preceded them, these start to become non-privileged terms in relation to a privileged term. And Deleuze and Guattari's question is, do we need to think about terms in a higher and lower way? Is there a way where we can talk about difference, such as the British and then their modern instantiations? Is there a way to talk about this where we're not going into certain ideas of certain forms being more perfect than the other? And we could think of this the other way around too. This for example, was prominent in the race science of Nazi Germany. They said that, look, we have these base forms, which are black people and Jews, and then up here we have the Aryan. And in a sense, we can see where this is kind of a reaction to Darwin, to kind of twist this to make it seem like there are less evolved forms and there are more perfect forms. And this turns around our terminology. Really, it doesn't matter which way you use it. The point is, do we think of the higher forms as better, or do we think of the fundamental forms as better? Because now Aryan becomes higher, more perfected, and these lower forms become base or unadvanced, or this one just makes me sick to even write, but primitive. So you can see the problem with representational thinking, that when we start to talk about terms in relations to other one, and we start to talk about, oh, this thing is more fundamental, or this thing's a higher instantiation of this lower base form, we're getting into a situation where not only do we have oppression, but it becomes inherent in the identity of something. And this is kind of what Edward Said says in defense of otherness, is kind of going off of Foucault, that, for example, the Orient is created in its relationship to Orientalism, to kind of Western conceptions of the world outside of Europe or the US. And when we start to do this, the question is, if this disenfranchised form, whether it's on the bottom or the top, kind of like we talked about, can it ever be truly recognized? Or is it only a function of its lowly place, or its inferior place, wherever it is? And Deleuze and Guattari think that this way of thinking bodes very negatively for being able to live freely. In a sense, this is a little bit different than, for example, Heidegger is talking about authentic being, of authenticity, and he thinks of deficient modes of being, such as being absorbed in das Man. Deleuze and Guattari aren't really for that. They want to try to create lines of flight. They want identities and objects to only exist insofar as they are springboards for something new. And in a sense, Deleuze and Guattari are trying to philosophize about the new. They say that the body without organs, this place upon which all identity springs forth, this undeveloped three-dimensional space which harbors all possibilities and through which flows flow, is crisscrossed, and it has gradients, and it is not representative. Again, they say nothing is representative. Rather, it is all life and lived experience. They say, for example, the actual lived emotion of having breasts does not resemble breasts. And this is kind of an important point, and their raunchy language is quite strange, but quite helpful too, which is to say, the emotion of having breasts, of what it feels like, whatever that means for you, whether that means some sense of hyper-femininity, whether it is an encroachment upon your identity, maybe you feel like, this might be someone who is trans, for example, and the existence of the breasts upon their body is a violation of their sense of subjecthood. Whatever that feeling is, ontologically and phenomenologically, it is not reducible to the breasts themselves, which is to say, if we have an object like breasts, and we have a subject which has the breasts, and that having produces an emotion of what it is like to have breasts. If we try to talk about breasts, Deleuze and Guattari are so weird sometimes. They are, I don't know, round, supple, I don't know, I'm just coming up with random things. They're round, supple, they're made of skin. They have these things existentially or phenomenologically, which it is, we're talking about the isness of the breasts. Over here, for the emotion of what it feels like to have breasts, it may be validation. It may be violation. It may be uncanny or something like this. You know, what it means to have breasts means very different things for very different people. For some people, it's an affirmation of their identity and something that they take a lot of pride in. For other people, it is, I mean, we could think of this in the Muslim context of hiding your beauty, per se, or concealing your beauty with the hijab or the burqa or other things like this, that for a Muslim, having breasts is, I mean, it's kind of like the Christian saying that your body's a temple or whatever. It is viewed very differently by different people with different conceptions of the emotion that results from this object. But when we look at these properties, they're not the same. Validation is not round. Violation is not skin. Supple is not uncanny. They're not the same thing. And this is the problem of having emotions or experiences be a derivative of objects that are given. This idea of a subject-object experience or something like this, where there's some differentiation. Deleuze and Guattari want to say, this is valid, 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 valid. All of these are experiences that we cannot deny. There is the, maybe what Heidegger might call the ontic. And, you know, it's just a feature of the world, and it's kind of the reality, not talking about ontology, but just kind of talking about categories and adjectives that are in the world. And then we've got these feelings right here, and oftentimes in philosophy, there's a sense of trying to dismiss feelings as secondary to what they are the referent of. And Deleuze and Guattari want to say, no. We want a philosophy of affirmation that affirms different subjectivities, different experiences, and that doesn't try to create a more perfect experience than others. I want to touch a little bit on some of their vocabulary. For example, the body without organs. Now, as we kind of saw earlier, there is a process that goes about creating, for example, breasts versus the feeling of having breasts. And Deleuze and Guattari want to say that all forms, everything that is ontological, everything that is is a process of desiring production and of flows. And this is to say, we can think of this if we just draw out a bunch of different flows. I mean, this is kind of like, you could think of this like particles that are interacting with each other. They are maximally contingent upon one another. If we're thinking about this in terms of like the idea of using otherness to establish identity, each one of these flows reciprocally uses the other in order to define its particular position. You know, this flow is in relation to another flow. And as such, this is the idea of desiring production. And this is a crucial thing that Deleuze and Guattari want to say when they get rid of representational, or what they call arborescent thinking. Arbor as in tree, like arbor in Spanish. And they want to get rid of this idea that certain experiences are necessarily more true than other experiences. They want to say, look, experience is experience. Reality is reality. Isness is isness. There is no hierarchicalization in being, because if we try to do that, certain terms become disenfranchised. And instead, they want to say that, look, all identity is related through flows, through processes of production, where every experience is a productive experience. There aren't experiences that are counterproductive. Everything is a production of a new thing. And, you know, maybe someone wants to say, I don't know, the creation of cars is counterproductive to the way things used to be. Deleuze and Guattari want to get out of that, the way things used to be kind of talk. They want to say, look, things are what they are. And they are related in a system of flows to one another in such an extent that the objects and the identities that result from these flows are, insofar as they are related to each of these flows contingently. Which is to say, there are not these terms that exist outside of flows. And this is their problem with Oedipus, for example, is that Oedipus wants to take all of these flows and box them in and put Oedipus on top of them. I didn't want to put it up there just in case you couldn't see. But Oedipus is structuring all these flows. So what is allowed to show itself is identified in relation to an outside form that is not itself acted upon. You could use God, you could use power, you could use politics, whatever it is. Deleuze and Guattari want to say no. There are no non-contingent terms. They want to say that everything that is productive. It is new. It is something. And it is something because it is not something else. It is something unique with its own identity. And they want to understand identity in this contingent process. Now, how do we get from pure flows? And this is the weird part about Deleuze and Guattari, is they are realists. They are not idealists. So they do want to affirm that everything is real, in a sense, that there are no ideal categories that stand above the real, but there's the real itself, kind of like Baudrillard. And the question is, how do we get from these kind of abstract flows, which are both, like fluids and also flows of ideas from one person to the other, flows of taboos, whatever it is, because this is in relation to Freud, of course, and is a critique of Freud, of course, and Lacan. And the question is, how do we get from just these flows to the objects that result from them? How do we reach subject formation? This is a continuing theme across philosophy, starting from Descartes onwards. Maybe you could even say Hegel onwards, or the pre-Socratics onwards. It's a question in philosophy for a long time, because this identifies what it is to be. Is how does being arise? What does this process entail? Deleuze and Guattari want to talk about the body without organs. Now, what is that? Because you hear it and you think of an empty husk, a person without eyeballs, or without a bladder, or without glands, or without anything. It's just an empty husk. And in a sense, that is a useful way of talking about this, but I think it's important to kind of abstract this out a little bit and visualize it to talk about what they're saying. They say, the body without organs, the unproductive, the unconsumable, serves as a surface for the recording of the entire process of production of desire, so that desiring machines seem to emanate from it in the apparent objective movement that establishes a relationship between the machines and the body without organs. An important term here is desiring machines. And desiring machines is, of course, an obvious term when we've talked about everything as resulting from flows of desire, of ways of connecting and synthesizing with other things to create identities. So desiring machines is kind of Deleuze and Guattari's ways of talking about the subject, that it is always a result of a machine. And their point about machines is that machines are always productive. Even when they are unproductive, that is only insofar as they are producing in a certain way. Namely, they are producing less than they normally would. Or even when they aren't functioning, that idea of the machine being non-functional is in relation to a form of functionality, namely producing. So they want to say that everything is a machine. And they say that the body without organs is the unproductive. It doesn't produce anything. The unconsumable, it's not swallowed up by anything. It's infinitely expansive. And that it serves as a surface for the recording of the entire process of production of desire. So these flows are productions of desire, of various forms of desire that swirl around and form these conjunctive syntheses with each other, and these different intersections and geodesic lines, and they use all these different forms and terms for talking about it. And the body without organs is the plane on which this is constructed. It's kind of like we really can't talk about point A and point B. In terms of the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, difference is important for establishing the identity, because A on its own is just a tautology, kind of like red. All you can say is A is A. It's a point. Well, what's a point? A point is a point. When we have 2 points, now we're cooking with gas, right? Now we can say that A is not B. And that's definitive because it bases identity in something else that has identity. So there's a reciprocal relation. But we can only talk about them in abstract relations. We can't talk about, well, what is A, for example, in space or in time? And this is an important category for Kant or Heidegger. And the idea is that if we form a coordinate plane, and we have various spaces along the plane, now we can start cooking, because we can say A is 1, 3, and B is 4, 2. So we can start to say something very definitive about it when we put it in a matrix. We can call this like an analytic matrix or a discursive situation. In relation to the body without organs, that is basically what this is. It is a point on which identity can instantiate itself. And this body without organs is a three-dimensional space, and I did the best I could with that three-dimensional space. But we've got our x-plane here, our y-plane here. This is our normal two-dimensional coordinate plane. And then we've got an extension out this way, which is our z-plane, right? So now, or our z-axis. So now we have a three-dimensional plane, and this is the infinite, empty, unconsumable space that production occurs upon. And this is the place where territorialization happens. And we can think of this very simply, because it is an important term that they're going to use a lot more in A Thousand Plateaus. But if you think of a country that establishes its territory, it identifies something as U.S. land. It's kind of like when we put the flag on the moon. It is America's moon now. It has become territorialized. It has relation, or it has identity in relation to an outside term, kind of like we could talk about God or Oedipus or power or whatever, or politics or whatever it may be. Territorialization is the instantiation of forms really in relationship to the whole. It's these fixed identities which have identity in their relation to a signifier, to something that signifies what it is to be that thing. This might be like language or something like that. But if we start to look at, we have the body without organs is this three-dimensional plane, and we have on the body without organs these various flows, and they form these syntheses at various points, some bigger than others, but there's all these different points. And this is the emergence of objects. And we can see when we put it like this, some of these flows might be, traditions. Some of these might be urges. Some of them might be urine or feces, because they love to use all those terms. They like to use everything. So we can see we have very tangible things like physical flows. This could be water, urine, feces, whatever it is. And we have these more abstract things like urges and traditions. And in a sense, like we talked about the difference between breasts and having breasts, the idea of urges, you could say, well, urges are not some far-off thing. They are, in fact, chemical processes. But Deleuze and Guattari would say the chemical processes and the urges which result from them is just like breasts themselves and the emotion of having them, that they are not reducible ontologically to one another. So in a sense, we have this ontological equality between all these different flows. And flows is a really useful term we can see in this way. And they create all these territorializations, these syntheses, these identifications, these partial objects is what Deleuze and Guattari want to call them, is partial objects. But these objects, these flows are always flowing. This is something that they take from Hegel, who took it from Heraclitus, and for example, I'm going to do a video on Guattari's Becoming Woman, which is a very interesting essay, which deals very directly with this idea of identity is a becoming. As soon as we try to treat identity like Oedipus or like God, something that exists that is non-contingent, that is not related to production or desire, that stands on its own as a privileged term, we've gone astray because, even a Hegel understands this, that identity is becoming. And Hegel kind of wants to try to do a sleight of hand and say the truth with a capital T, the absolute, is becoming, and that makes becoming something codified as becoming. It's very weird. But Deleuze and Guattari really want to try to understand the idea of identity as a becoming, as something that's constantly changing. And with these flows, these partial objects will only remain for an infinitesimally small amount of time before they will go on to shift, and they will go on to create new relations. And this does not mean that everything blips into existence and immediately blips out of existence. That's not what they're trying to say. They're not trying to go for this ontology of minimal relation or of minimal contact. A philosophy of minimal contact is what we could call that. That's not what they're trying to do. If we think about, let's just erase part of this. If we have one of these red flows and we look at it in abstract, and they overarch with each other, they form these partial objects at the point of their intersection. But these flows are not stagnant. This is not how being works. So let's imagine, for example, that this one on the left that starts here at point A and ends here at point B and crosses through right here. Let's imagine that this one, relative to the other one, is moving down. So in relation to one, it's going like that. This is kind of like how Einstein wanted to think of motion and relativity. That, it's always relative to an inertial reference frame. If we imagine this point A to point B, we could call this kind of some kind of compound flow right here. As these flows move, so will these partial objects. These partial objects will move down, and the point at which it intersects with the other flow is going to change. So it's not like they just meet and immediately come apart, but rather their contingent relationships are constantly changing. It's like particles that hit one and cause a proton to fall off or something. They always have these relations by which they collide, and then they move on to create new contingent relations. And Deleuze and Guattari thinks that when we go into representational thinking, we're doing a grave disservice to this situation here. And that in fact, we are failing to understand the innate capacity for newness that is inherent in ontology. I will be doing more videos on Anti-Oedipus in the future, but I think this is a good place to stop to really get our foot in the door as to their larger project, because that was really helpful for me getting into Deleuze and Guattari. I tried to start Anti-Oedipus twice previously at different points and failed miserably. The first few pages of Anti-Oedipus are, I think, a lot more dense than after you pass maybe section 2 of chapter 1. It opens up and it starts to make a lot more sense. I think they really are very abstract in the beginning. But it is important to realize that the title Anti-Oedipus may make it seem like they are trying to, they are doing this scathing critique of Oedipus, but not in the sense that they think it's unuseful. They think, just like this ontological equality we talked about, Oedipus is just as useful about talking about flows and about the partial objects that result from them as theology is, or as politics or power or anything else. Their problem is that they see things like Oedipus as being restrictive. They are anti-Oedipus insofar as it is just Oedipus. If it is just Oedipus as the overarching narrative that explains everything, they show very well that it's not a productive category insofar as it is insistent that it is always right. You cannot get out from under Oedipus. Even in the psychoanalytic literature around Freud's time, and even into Lacan, about resolving Oedipus is precisely a way to kind of get under Oedipus's foot forever. Instead, they want to say Oedipus or something, or something, or Oedipus and something else, and something else. They say that Oedipus is not any better than any other analytical framework. They want to try to get out of under the foot of meta-narratives in sort of a different way than Foucault does. Foucault is a little bit more critical insofar as he just takes a historical analysis of the situation and he's like, this is how we are. And we are stuck under power. And Deleuze and Guattari would probably say, yeah, we're stuck under power, as are we everything else. And we should focus on how to create new lines of flight. And if it's just Oedipus, then it forms what is called the analytical imperialism of the Oedipus complex, as they say. And instead, they don't want to be anti-Oedipus insofar as they want to react against Oedipus. Because they say quite rightly, they don't want to get rid of psychoanalysis in a sense of reacting against it and finding a new line of flight. That's not what they mean. They think that, in fact, in order to form lines of flight, in order to form new ways to connect flows together and create new partial objects, to do this requires paying homage to all of the contingent situations that brought it into being. So Oedipus is contingent just like everything else. It's an analytical framework just like everything else is. It's a way of experiencing just like everything else is, and a way of thinking just like everything else is. And instead, they don't want to be anti-Oedipus insofar as they want to be contra-Oedipus. They don't want to do that. Instead of being contra-Oedipus and going against, in a reactionary sort of way against Oedipus, they want to be trans-Oedipus. They want to say, look, let's transfer from psychoanalysis to phenomenology to every which way we can. And we shouldn't create a stark opposition, because now our movement is just defined by the very thing that we tried to cast off. Now we are, insofar as we are in relation to the terrorism of the signifier that they're trying to get rid of. Instead, they want to utilize whatever is there. They want to take stock of everything. They want to use everything to its maximum potential and even create new potential. And in this sense, we can see they really represent the optimism of Nietzsche. Nietzsche had this critique of morality, of God, and talked about the will to power and the eternal recurrence of the same and all this. And a lot of people call Nietzsche a nihilist because of this. And this is a very big debate about what is Nietzsche, what kind of thinker is he, because he kind of has two sides, which is represented by Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault. But Nietzsche also was a very affirmative philosopher. He wanted to affirm the earth. He wanted to say, look, let's get away from God, just for the same reason that Deleuze and Guattari did, because it is a It is the terrorism of the signifier. It is the imperialism of God, in a sense, of becoming this privileged term. Instead, let's take stock of what's here. Let's learn to dance like Zarathustra, and let's learn to preach of the earth, as Nietzsche says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I think that's what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do. They're trying to preach of the earth. They're trying to preach of the desiring machine instead of trying to preach of Oedipus. So I hope this has been a good lecture, and I hope this has given you something helpful, and I'll see you in another lecture.